Okay, we are live. Wait a moment till everybody gets here. We're going to discuss this week's Torah portion. As always, this week's Torah portion is Parshas Told Us. We're doing this Wednesday night because tomorrow is Thanksgiving. People have plans. Next week we'll be back on our regular Thursday evening schedule. And as always, check out Facebook, YouTube, Instagram for the recording. And feel free to comment. And we will get to it when we get to it. We will answer your questions. Okay. So, in this week's Torah portion is really the main Torah portion that talks about Isaac. Last week we talked about Isaac in the context that he was, he gets married, but really, and in the previous portion he was born and he has the binding of Isaac. But in all those scenarios, it really wasn't about him. It was about Abraham, right? Abraham binds Isaac. Abraham is the one who sends his servant Eliezer, as we spoke about last week, to find a wife for Isaac. Isaac was not allowed to leave the land of Israel. We'll discuss that also today, right? And therefore, really, this is the Torah portion that talks about Isaac himself. So every single one of our forefathers had left a legacy, more than a legacy. They left a empowerment that they gave, right? Being our forefathers, we inherit from them certain things. So, for example, from Abraham, we get the idea of self-sacrifice, right? Abraham sacrifices himself, whether it's through throwing himself into the fiery furnace that we read about in the Medrash, or in the Torah, we read about him leaving his comfort zone, his father's house, his father's land, and obviously the binding of Isaac. He sacrifices everything that he had sacrificed for. So through Abraham, we get the idea of self-sacrifice. What about Isaac? What is it that we learn from Isaac? So let's go back. Let's go back to what Isaac was all about. His birth, right? His birth happened in a supernatural manner, right? Versus his brother, he had a brother, Ishmael, right? Famously. Ishmael was born from a different woman, right? Not they were brothers from the same father. Ishmael was born. His father was not so old. His mother was not old. It was within childbearing years. So it was not a miracle of the birth of Ishmael. Versus Isaac, his birth was miraculous, right? That we know that when the angels came to visit Avram Avinu, they come to visit Abraham, and they say, "We're going to come, and next year, you're going to have a son." And the Torah tells us Abraham and Sarah were old, and Sarah was no longer in childbearing years, and she started to laugh, right? Which is why Isaac was named that name, Vatitzchak, and she laughed, right? So Isaac was named after that. And she says, I'm old and my husband's old. So Yitzchak versus Yishmael, his birth was already in a supernatural manner. Then we have the bris, that both Yishmael and Yitzchak had a bris. Yishmael had a bris at 13 years old, right? Because that's the age that he was already that age when God commanded everybody to get a bris, so he was already 13, so he got a bris at the age of 13. Then we have Yitzchak, Isaac, was given the bris at the correct age, so to speak, at the age that God commanded Abraham to give them that every child should get a bris, which is 8 days old, just like God commanded him. So, really, having a bris is a risky procedure, right? There's risk involved. And like Maimonides says that we always try to postpone a bris if there's any risk factors involved. So why? Maimonides says very clearly, you could always do a bris at a later date, but you can never get a life back. So, and obviously the risk is greater when a child is 8 days old, right? 7 days, we say the risk is very high. 8 days is already, a child is already, it's possible, but even then, it's not always possible, and we take the risk factors under consideration. But obviously, an adult, while the pain factor was going to be much higher by an adult versus a child, the the risk is higher. So what we see here is that the that even with Isaac's circumcision, he was kind of beyond. It was a sort of a miracle, right? He was the first one to be circumcised at 8 days old, and it was kind of an above nature, right? That even though natural order says it's a risky situation, he did it. He was able to go through that, as many of us did. So what did Isaac? What was the first thing that we're going to talk about that Isaac really bequeathed to us as one of the forefathers? Is really this idea that Isaac lived in a way of completely above nature, right? For example, we talked about this in this week's parsha, and we mentioned it last week as well, that Isaac was not allowed to leave the land of Israel, right? In this week's Torah portion, the Torah portion starts off, there's a famine, and by Abraham, God says, leave the land of Israel, go find food. By Isaac, God says, stay in the land of Israel, go find food within the land of Israel, go find sustenance within the land of Israel. He says, you're not allowed to leave the land of Israel. Why? Because you were brought as a perfect korban, right? You were Isaac, by the money of Isaac, right? There was, Isaac was brought onto the altar, and because of that, he was considered in that holy state, just like a sacrifice in the holy temple, where he's not allowed to leave the land of Israel. It has to be eaten or burned on the altar in the land of Israel. So to Isaac was not allowed to leave the land of Israel. So really, this is what Isaac teaches us. This is what he gave to us, is this ability for the Jewish people to live above nature. So through him being this perfect, wholesome korban, this perfect, wholesome offering, sacrifice, everything he did was beyond nature. And that is the way that God deals with us as well. Okay, so that's the first thing. The next thing that we're going to talk about is the divine protection that Isaac had. So we go back to the first part of the Torah portion, and we have the story of the birth of Jacob and Esav. Right, Yaakov and Esav, how were they born? It says that Isaac and Rivka were both praying. Why? Why were they praying? Because she was barren. So how is it possible to know that she was barren? Maybe Isaac couldn't have children. How do we know that Yitzchak wasn't the one that had the problem? And again, similarly, that he was not allowed to take another wife because, again, he was this perfect offering, so that was another restriction versus Abraham took another woman and he had Ishmael. Isaac was not allowed to do that. So if he didn't have that option, then how would he know? It's not like maybe it was both of them. So we could say that it's a pretty simple answer. That Abraham was promised that Isaac was going to be Ki Yitzchak Yikar L'Chazara, that through Isaac, that will be the chain, the lineage of Abraham will be defined specifically through Isaac. So Isaac knew that he was going to have children. So obviously, any issue was going to had to be Rivka. So it had to be that Rivka, his wife, was the one who was barren. But if we look at it a little deeper, we see that many times, other situations, that people were promised certain things, right? And nevertheless, they prayed for those things, even though they were promised them. Let's look at Isaac's son, Jacob. Jacob was promised that what? As God said, and I'll read it to you here, I will surely do good with you, and I will make your seed as numerous as the sand of the sea. So we see here that Jacob was promised, right, that only good things would happen to him. Nevertheless, Jacob prayed when things got rough, right? Even though he could have said, listen, I have a promise from God, so I don't need to pray. So in that case, maybe Isaac could have said, listen, I know that God gave me a blessing, right? But I still need to pray. Why does he still need to pray? Why did Jacob pray, even though that God had given him this promise? because maybe he had done something inappropriate, that maybe he had sinned, and that was holding back the blessing from coming down. So here's the key, is that Isaac was, as we said earlier, Isaac was a perfect offering to God. So he knew that it was guaranteed this blessing because he had never sinned in his whole life, right? That because he had this idea that this divine protection, that not only that he had certain restrictions on where he could live and who he could marry because of his special status as a sacrifice, but also that also protected him from ever coming into a situation that he would ever sin. So he knew that it would never happen, that whatever was going on, he had never sinned. And later in the Torah portion, right, when he blesses Jacob, right? Jacob pretends to be Esau because Esau was the older of the twins, and Isaac tells Esau, "I want to bless you." Rivka helps Jacob fool his father, and he gives the blessings to Jacob. And Esau comes and he tells him, I'm here for my blessing." And it says in the Torah that he shuddered a great shudder, that Isaac was terrified that he had given the blessings to the wrong person. Okay, so you want to say, he made a mistake. What was he so upset that he gave the blessings? Okay, he'll give another blessing, right? And he does. He gives Esau another blessing. But actually, what was going on in that scenario was that when Yaakov took the blessings, at that point, Isaac thought that Esau was the rightful owner of the blessings, and therefore he thought he had made a mistake. He said, "How is it possible that I can make a mistake if I have godly protection? Then I'm never going to make a mistake." But later in that conversation, when he realizes that Esau had actually forfeited his blessings besides his behavior, but also he had actually sold the birthright to Jacob, right? And then Isaac said, "Okay, I didn't do anything wrong." So actually, that idea that Jacob had to go this whole trickery in order to get the blessings actually was divine protection to make sure that Isaac gave it to the rightful owner, right? Because Isaac didn't know that Jacob had bought the blessings from Esau, so he thought that. So at that point, he thought he had made a mistake, but actually, by Jacob circumventing that situation, he actually gave it to the rightful owner. So what do we see from here? Is that a person we have to serve God in a supernatural way, right? Isaac gave us that ability, that not to necessarily look at human nature and say we are defined by human nature, and even more so, that through that, actually, not only will we be able to do the Torah mitzvahs, but actually God will protect us, right? That God will protect us, that we'll never end up in a scenario where we can make a mistake. Now, this idea is also brought out in the idea that we talk about what is the type of service of God of Isaac versus Abraham. Isaac's service of God was in a way of fear, versus Abraham was in a way of love, right? Chesed versus Gevura, as talked about in the Kabbalistic ideas. Chesed means kindness, generosity. Gevura means strictness, powerful strictness. So, what the idea of fearing God versus loving God is, both of them actually have the same idea. You're trying to get close to God, which really comes through love. But Isaac actually, not only did he love God, but he feared God, and through that fear, he actually nullified himself totally to God. And therefore, what Isaac was able to do was, instead of what Abraham could only use his own capabilities and his own talents, his own skill set, and he did it with all his skill set, which was tremendous. He was a tremendous person. He was able to come close to God through his own understanding, right? At the age of 3 or at the age of 40, depending on the measures or different levels of that, Abraham on his own recognized godliness. Isaac, on the other hand, never had an opportunity to have his own ideas. He totally was nullified to God. And actually, in that way, he was actually able to nullify himself in such a way that actually he was able to use the capabilities, that godly capabilities. And that's why he had this superpower that not only he never made a mistake and he never sinned, but also that he actually was able to live on a higher level than nature, right? That he couldn't even handle leaving the land of Israel. He couldn't handle marrying somebody who, another woman, right? Because he was destined for this thing, that he was living on God's terms, essentially. And it kind of a way to understand this is that when the example is given of a servant of a king. If a servant of a king, he totally nullifies himself. He has no self-identity. In fact, when somebody sees him, they don't even know his name. It's not important, right? He's the servant of the king. But what is the power? Even though he has no self-identity, what is his superpower? His superpower is, because he lost his own identity, his identity is that of the king, and he could do the things that the king does. For example, let's say there's certain things that only a king could do, like collect taxes, or capital punishment, or go to war, right? And this servant can carry out those things for the king, right? Because he has totally nullified his own existence, and the only thing he has is the king's existence. And that is the way Isaac served God, right? And therefore, he lived on this higher plane, that he was able to communicate. He was just communicating God's talents, right? Instead of using his own talents and his own skill set, he was able to communicate God's talents, and therefore he could live on this higher level where things are in a supernatural way, so to speak. And obviously, the lesson for us is that if we live on this if we could nullify ourselves to God, and instead of living on our own terms, we live on God's terms, then we can also live in a way that's beyond nature. We can live in a way that we're protected from the outside world, right? Because we're living on a higher plane. We're living on an existence that's not our own. We're living on God's existence, which is the true existence, obviously. Okay, got a little deep there. All right. I want to wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving weekend. Hopefully you're thankful for this Parsha year, and we will see you next week, Thursday. God willing, back to our regular schedule Thursday. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to comment down below, and we will get to them in the near future. All the best. Have a good Shabbos.